Greetings, fellow explorers, and welcome to episode 8 of Geekoscopy 101. It's the podcast show that explores the nexus between science, story, wonder, and philosophy. With me, your host, Dr. Yanis Kisten, and today we're exploring the psychology of games with none other than the Psychgeist of gaming herself, Dr. Rachel Kowert. How are you doing, Dr. Kowert?
I am doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I'm really happy to speak to you. Like I said a bit earlier, I've been dying to get one of your circle on my show because I feel like
I'm first. Yes,
you're the first one. Yeah, I feel like you guys are doing really interesting research. It's fairly like new research. I've actually been looking through because I wanted to do a YouTube video about the science of like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And a lot of the research is fairly recent. Like there's one paper from the 80s, I think. The like papers after 2000, it started like trickling in. So, but yeah, science to do with video games and Dungeons and Dragons, fairly new, and I'm really interested. Even being a marine biologist who's got nowhere near the field, but I dig this type of stuff. So, Dr. Kowert, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are in this moment and what you do?
Sure. I am a research psychologist. I am also the research director of Take This, which is the first mental health nonprofit to form serving the gaming community and the gaming industry specifically. I'm also a science content creator, Psychgeist, where I talk about the science of games. I create weekly YouTube videos and stream on Saturdays.
Yeah, so it's been interesting. You just started up your Twitch journey, and I've been on the front lines there. Yes. and your YouTube videos as well.
Yes, it is interesting to say the least.
Pretty interesting. Content creation is, it is a journey that we all are on. Some of us for a really long time. But yeah, it's fun. It's something you can enjoy because you're creating something, you know.
Yeah, I really do enjoy creating the YouTube videos, I have to say. I get a lot of joy of kind of drawing the curtain back behind the science of games in different ways, or talking about, vocabulary terms or active debates. I find the streaming is a lot harder because you have to just talk for a long time into the void and be entertaining, and it's totally different. It's totally different.
It is a skill I'm still working on. I'm considering doing like improv classes or something to try and maybe get maybe some kind of qualification to help, because talking to yourself it's a skill. You have to try and get like your internal monologue like out. And it's difficult to do.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. What have I been thinking about today? That's why I talk a lot about food on my stream. Food and science, my two loves.
So how did you end up as somebody who's into research gravitating towards gaming?
It was a roundabout journey. I went to get my master's degree in counseling psychology. I wanted to be a therapist. From like as long as I can remember, I wanted a degree in psychology, and you have to have advanced degrees in psychology to do anything in psychology. So I went to get my master's degree, and while I was there, towards the end, you do an internship where you do therapy, basically. And I saw 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of parents saying, my children are playing a lot of World of Warcraft. I'm really concerned. This was the heyday of World of Warcraft, 2006-ish. I'm really concerned that it's affecting them in some negative way, physically, socially, psychologically. They're in their room for hours on end. What's happening here? And at the time, I was playing a lot of World of Warcraft, number one. And number two, there was little to no research. There was maybe like 2 research papers at all in game studies as a whole. And they were both by Nick Yee, and they were the only ones that existed. So kind of a little selfishly, because I was quite concerned about my own well-being after so many parents raised concerns. But secondly, I wanted, as a budding clinician, to have this information to give to the parents. I also knew that therapy, while it was very interesting, and I'm very happy I did my master's degree, it wasn't something I wanted to do day in and day out. So from then, I pursued a research-based PhD, focusing on the impact of games, because I saw there was a need and a gap for it.
Like you said earlier, it's like a lot of people who deal with psychology tend to become, clinicians and therapists. So yeah, I think researchers are much rarer in this space. So, like, what was that moment that you decided to go from trying to be a clinician to researcher? Like, what changed your mind?
To be honest, my first day, my first day of my master's program, I went into class and I sat down and I was like, no, I don't want to do this every day, because it's really it's emotionally draining. It's a lot of active listening. So therapy is, but I'm still very interested in therapy, and I knew that I wanted to do research after the first day. Research that helped clinicians better do their job. So I was like, I'm going to do my master's, because how am I going to understand what clinicians need unless I also have that training and see what their day-to-day is like and see what they need. So I completed the master's with that in mind, thinking, okay, I'm going to go get a research degree. But if I have this master's, it will make me a better researcher. And I think it did in the end.
So instead of choosing a healing class, you went for support. Essentially. So
yes, that's true. I am a rogue on D&D. Actually, a druid rogue. So I like to change jobs.
Druid rogue. That's an interesting multi-class.
Yeah,
I would like to see your stat sheet. Yes.
It's interesting. Okay, to be fair, we're going to talk about D&D later. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, let's get back to video games. So what are some of your favorite video games?
I love role-playing games. Final Fantasy is my favorite franchise. I love them all. Legend of Zelda. I like simulation games. I like Civilization and The Sims. And I like pretty much any game that is not a scary game or a game where you get chased by something, because it stresses me out. So like I'll play GTA, but when the cops chase me, I literally pause it and I'm like, husband, get the cops away from, because it's so stressful for me to try and get away. Like if I have more than like 3 stars, that's it. I'm done. Like I can't get away. I get too nervous.
Max out at 3 stars. That's interesting. Yeah, I really don't like horror games either. I feel like I don't understand it. Like, I don't try to understand
me either.
it. It's one of those things where I think you like. It's either like, what do you think? It's either like a quiet taste, or you just predisposed to like it when you're born. Is it something genetic?
I don't know. It's the same people who go into haunted houses on purpose. Definitely don't do that. Yeah. Right? And some people love it.
Yeah. I wouldn't. I would end up like punching some of the things.
Oh my God, I know. When I was in college, I was an RA, so I like lived on the floor with the freshmen, and I was like in charge of my group of freshmen. And for Halloween, they went into like this haunted house, and the people I worked with were like, "You have to go," and I was like, "Do I? Is this part of my job description?" But I was so scared, and like people were running around and like tackling other people, like because it was so scary. And it's like, why am I in here? It's the only one I've ever done, and I hated it, and it was horrible.
I can imagine. So when it comes to, actually researching video games, like how is that different from other types of psychological studies, or are they essentially the same? Like, what do you do different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's similar in a way that it's rooted in theory. A lot of social science research, especially psychology, is very deeply rooted in theory. But with games, at least it was for me when I was starting out, and I would say still to some extent, it's almost like you have to validate its importance before you can research it. So I remember during my PhD, every year you had to give a departmental talk to the whole department. It was very nerve-wracking, especially as a first-year PhD student. And every year I gave my talk, I had to have 5 minutes of games are a billion-dollar industry. Millions of people play games. Games are important because, and other people, like, when they're studying the way you process words or memory or sleep studies, like they don't have to have that bit at the beginning where they have to justify why it's important that they're spending their time on this research. The other thing with games is that the technology is constantly changing, right? So I was studying, I was a little past the World of Warcraft era. The people before me were more the EverQuest and World of Warcraft era, but now it's like virtual reality and augmented reality. So you really, it morphs as time goes on. So I think in those 2 ways, it's quite different.
Yeah, it's sort of a shifting goalpost. I would suspect.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
a
that's a perfect way of putting
it's
it.
a really interesting thing with esports, actually, compared to regular sports, because regular sports really have set rules that are kind of like locked in, and there might be like a change once in a decade or a blue moon. Whereas video games are getting updated sometimes, every week, every month. You could just get patches out of nowhere, and it's completely, it's part of the sport is to actually adapt to that, which is interesting. Well, I was thinking about the research, because academia can sometimes be very slow. So when you want to try and do something, and your goalposts are shifting, I can imagine it can be really difficult to catch it.
That's a fun effect of studying games, I guess. And this actually, what I was going to say is, I've been working on a grant proposal for like 8 months, or I was up until COVID started, about video game addiction. And then COVID started, and the discourse changed away from video game addiction. And even the World Health Organization came out and was like, actually, games are a great way to socially connect. Which on the one hand is great. I'm glad the conversation's changing. On the other hand, it was not so great for my grant proposal, because it made it irrelevant because nobody was talking about it anymore.
Yeah.
So you have to really adjust.
Yeah, it's like one of those moments when you find a paper that literally did what you wanted to do like 30 years ago. And it's like, no.
Yep.
Yeah,
It happens.
I can imagine. And even during this time, like, didn't the FDA approve some kind of game for therapy and stuff? So
Yes,
definitely
for ADHD treatment. Yeah.
the conversation around these type of things are beginning to change, which is cool. But we do, I think, almost like on a clockwork basis, we always get this this fight between video games and violence. I think it's interesting to bring up now. Like, what's your view on that? What does the research say?
The research, as far as all of the debates and game studies go, that one actually has the most supporting evidence against it. There is no evidence to suggest that playing violent video games leads to real world violence. But the discourse gets kind of twisted, is that there is research to show that playing violent video games can sometimes lead to short-term increases in aggression in laboratory studies. But there's like so many problems with this research. What's considered a violent study in one game is considered an action game that has positive outcomes in another, number one. Number two, the measures that they're using don't have the best real-world validity. A lot of them are like fill-in-the-blank tasks. So you go in, and you see KI blank blank, and you put KISS, kiss. Then you play 15 minutes of GTA, then you come out and you see KI blank blank, and instead of kiss, you put kill, and that's considered an increase in aggression. Okay, fine, but what does that actually mean? An hour from now when I'm in the real world, is that going to have any kind of effect on my behavior? And the research generally says no. So media effects generally are small, and when it comes to video games and violence, there have been literally thousands of studies, and not a single one linking it to real world violent behavior.
Yeah, I mean, that's more or less, as somebody who's not in psychology, from what I gather, based on my limited research, that seems to be the case. That the generally accepted science is that it doesn't cause violence, and I mean, I think we knew this. Everybody who kind of play video games kind of know this. You might have aggression where you throw your controller at your TV if you're raging. But I don't think...
Right. But you know what? There's research from the Oxford Internet Institute that actually links that to frustration, which makes more sense to me, because I only do that when I'm playing first-person shooter games and my aim sucks. So that makes sense.
Yeah. FPSs are something you need like a lifetime to get used to.
To master. It's true.
Yeah, especially like if you play on a controller. And one of the weird things about me is that I can't play FPSs with the mouse and a keyboard, which is super weird.
It's so much better though.
I know.
Yeah,
it makes sense. Like it makes logical sense.
In my head.
But when it happens, I can't do it. Like I try to play like Valorant. That I think somebody's answer to Counter-Strike, and I just couldn't play it properly. I was like, I'm just so used to playing with a controller because I'm a console kid.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that's like
Yeah.
baked into my circuitry in my brain. I'd rather
You can't go now.
Use my thumb to look around instead of the mouse. But speaking of, research topics when it comes to video games, like what research questions are you trying to answer with your work, or have you tried to answer in the past?
I mean, my background is generally looked at the social impact of games. So how socializing online and games specifically impacts our ability to socialize offline when we're not in games. That's been historically what I've looked at, and also just the effects of games and friendship networks and other kind of social outcomes. These days, I'm more interested in things related to toxicity and dark participation in games and the interaction between users and what we can do to help make games a more welcoming space for everyone. So that's the kind of stuff I'm working on now, my own, and with Take This, and in conjunction with some other collaborations. Because, like we said, the goalpost is always moving, and so I got to move with the times. And toxicity is an issue, and it's been an issue for a long time, and there's still nothing really substantial to grab onto there. So I'm trying to fix that.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing that we kind of have put up with, I suppose, for decades, and we never really kind of nipped it in the bud, so it became ingrained into the culture, I think. Well, that's my theory. You would know more. But you mentioned something called dark participation. Like, what does that mean? How do you define that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so dark participation is a term actually coined by Thorsten Quandt at the University of Münster. And it's kind of like the big umbrella that encapsulates any kind of deviant behavior on the internet. So in his instance, his work is a little bit more in journalism. So it includes things like fake news and that sort of stuff. But when we talk about it in the context of games, anything under that would be like, cheating or doxing or swatting, all of those things. So toxicity is one little branch that would come out of dark participation. And what makes toxicity different from other kinds of deviant behavior is the intent. So there's malicious intent when it comes with whatever is considered trolling. So things like doxing and swatting and harassment. Whereas there's still other kinds of dark participation that wouldn't necessarily fall into trolling, things like contrary play. So playing the game in a way it's not intended to play. Things like speed running. You wouldn't necessarily call that trolling, but it is still a deviant behavior. So I like to use the bigger umbrella term just to kind of really distinguish between what is considered toxicity and what's just considered deviant.
Seems like pretty interesting research. How do you test that kind of stuff? Like how do you collect data for that?
So for as I stated before, it starts with theory, right? So I currently have a paper under review that's theoretical and actually provides the first that I know of attempt to catalog what would be considered dark participation in games. And games are really specific because they have the added element of the game, right? So things like I was saying, contrary play and cheating, that's really specific to games versus the internet in general. So you start with the theory, and then I'm also currently doing a survey study with Dr. Christine Cook at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And step one for us is really to see what's the spread on this behavior. Okay, is doxing 10% of all the dark participation that's happening? Because that's a problem. Or is it 0.5%? Because we don't even have those basic numbers. Is trash talking 99.9% of all toxic behavior? Then it's not really a problem as far as I'm concerned. Is it worth putting all this money and investment in researching 0.1% of what's happening? I mean, probably not. So first, let's figure out what exactly is happening. What's the rate of harassment? I mean, the ADL reported 23% of people say they've experienced harassment. Let's see if that number stands when we ask a different sample, because 23% is real high, and that's a problem, and we should look into that. So step one is just kind of looking at where we stand, where the community stands, and then we move forward and trying to figure out how to reverse this action and reverse this behavior and get it out as a cornerstone of gamer culture, which seems to be, at least when we talk about it.
Yeah, I get the feeling that because it's such a new branch of research, there's a lot of things you have to define and quantify, and terms you need to just straight up coin because they've never been used before. So
right.
it's
Exactly. And the thing with trolling too, it's like I was saying, it's a mess, right? So first you have to come up with a catalog of what behavior you're even talking about. Some people have like 6 behaviors and some have 20. And it's like, okay, well, where are the constraints? And then you can move forward.
When you look through your research about video games, was there any kind of list of how video games can actually be helpful to people instead of detrimental, like we've heard before from the media?
Yeah. There's a lot of ways that games are beneficial. I published a book in January of this year called Video Games and Wellbeing, and it's an edited collection. And the reason I published that book is because I wanted to highlight the positive effects of games. And it's actually the first book that's ever been published specifically highlighting the positive effects of games. So things like persistence and resilience and multitasking and creative thinking. And there's a lot. There's a lot of benefits that can happen unintentionally from playing games. So these are things, the games aren't designed to teach us these things, but through playing these stories and these games, we come out with these little gems and these little learning moments.
Yeah. It goes beyond, I suppose, like hand-eye coordination or thumb-eye coordination.
Right.
And I
Which
suppose
people talk about a lot, and that is true. The research supports that too, but there is more to it.
Yeah. Or obviously games that are intended for educational purposes in the first place. That obviously has a straight up way of making you better. But I'm really interested in getting into finding out, what exactly it does that I don't know about. So I need to get a hold of that book and have a look. But on the other side of the spectrum, where do you think the lines are in actually video games becoming detrimental to your health and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people who use games in a maladaptive way. I don't think that games themselves are an issue so much as understanding what the games are being used for. So, for example, people talk a lot about video game addiction. And if you go from a definition standpoint, video game addiction, to be considered within that realm, the games have to be the source of problems in every single area of your life. So occupationally, physically, socially, emotionally, every area of your life for an extended period of time. But what you find is that when you talk to people who are using games in this way, maybe games are being used as a coping strategy for an underlying condition, things like depression or anxiety or trauma or environmental stress or whatever it might be. And understanding that distinction is really important because as a therapist, if you're coming up with a treatment plan, if games are the coping strategy, you take the games away because you think games are the source of the problem, you're actually taking away their coping strategy. What you should be treating is the depression or the anxiety or the heightened stress. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of research still to be done there and really teasing it out. And I do think it's still an active discussion. But I don't think that games themselves, of course, they are designed to be engaging and they're designed to encourage people to continue to play. But to the extent in which it's causing detrimental problems in all areas of your life, I believe there's likely something else that needs to be looked at that's underlying this behavior and not the games themselves.
One of the interesting things that was, was it recent? Was it like a couple of years ago? But it's recent in my mind. But the concept of loot boxes in video games and what that does to the psychology of especially young kids. Do you have any thoughts on that type of stuff in games?
Yeah, so loot boxes are based on this idea of intermittent reinforcement, which is a very classic psychology thing that you learn in like Psych 101 about you give a rat a lever to push, and if he gets a reward every time, he gets bored of it. But if he gets a reward on the first time, and then the 5th time, and then the 6th time, and then the 10th time, and it's intermittent, he doesn't know when the reward is coming, he will push that lever all day long. And that's what loot boxes run on. They run on that idea of intermittent reinforcement. So, of course, they are desirable. My advice about loot boxes in children is don't let them buy them because they, of course, are desirable and they're colorful and they make noise and they pop and they're great. Of course, that's fun. That's why, adults buy scratch-off lottery tickets. It's the same idea. Not to say that they're gambling. That's actively debated. I'm not sure quite where I stand on that debate. More so that they're not gambling. But think that if you're concerned about your children in loot boxes, prevent them from purchasing them for sure. And then in terms of legal repercussions, I know that's being actively debated all over the world at the moment.
Yeah. It's one of those things where parenting comes in really important with your kids. Not that I know much about that, not being a parent, but having younger.
Well, I do have children. I can tell you, parental controls.
Younger siblings that I do have, and it is important to keep an eye on what they're doing, especially I think in a world that's changing so rapidly. And a human animal that is not adapted to all of this new, either this physical world or this digital landscape that, we could not have evolved in any jungle in Africa. It's like there's no tree that is giving out Wi-Fi. Right. So I think it's a very interesting thing that is happening in human evolution, and I'm really happy that there are people like you that are working on it now and trying to figure out like what is going on, because obviously you hear stories about how anxiety and depression, like the rates have just skyrocketed, and it's got to do with how the world is different than it was, a couple of decades ago. So going back to video games, if you, Dr. Kowert, were tasked with creating a video game, what would you think it would be? Would you do it? Firstly, let's say if you had to create one that was meant to be helpful, what would that look like? And if you had to create one for fun, what would that look like?
Oh, goodness. My brother and I were kids. We used to draw little games like dungeon crawlers on graph paper and be like, an enemy would be here. So I think if it was for fun, it would just be like a fun, silly 8-bit dungeon crawler. I mean, I think those are classic. They never go out of style. If I was doing something to be helpful, I see a lot of games being developed for mental health. I don't think I would develop one necessarily for mental health, but I really like the idea of games that portray mental health in accurate ways. So, like Celeste or Gris or Stardew Valley or Senua's Sacrifice, Hellblade, all of these games are fun games in and of themselves, but they also provide information, or they represent mental health in accurate ways. And I think I know that's really important. We get a lot of our information about mental health from media, and being able to experience it through this medium, I think is particularly powerful. Especially there's a video that Ninja Theory has up from testimonials of people who've played Hellblade, who have schizophrenia, and saying it was so powerful for them to be like, hey, mother, play this game. This is what my life is like. Like, this is what it's like in my mind. And to be able to experience it and to play it in games interactively is totally different than like reading a book about it. So maybe something like that. I have lofty dreams if I think my game's going to be like Hellblade, but we're dreaming, so I'll just go there.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, Hellblade is really a technical marvel, and it's also. It does portray mental health in a very interesting way that kind of, you start questioning yourself when you're playing it, like you question your own, like what is happening.
The point.
Yeah, what is going on, and it's really cool. But I think, I don't think like making that type of game is so out of reach than it was like maybe 20 years ago. Going forward with all of these, sort of engines being created that make it easier and hardware that makes it easier. I think these days it's just like you find a development team, and if you have the money, you can just make a game that you want to make.
And people are more open to it. I mean, like Sea of Solitude was very popular, and Celeste, and those are both very mental health heavy games. So
I really enjoyed Stardew Valley when I played it. I think it brings back, well, it kind of, how do I put this in useful terms? It kind of flips the idea on its head of, instant gratification. Because it takes so long in Stardew Valley to do anything, and kind of the reason why video games are so compelling is that there's a lot of instant gratification. You press a button and something happens. But with Stardew Valley, it's slow and it kind of plods along, but you have kind of these lofty goals and these plans, and you just chip away at it slowly. And I think that's a kind of a good analogy for just life in general. You just like chip away at it slowly. And,
totally.
And
totally. Because if you go too fast, you faint in the mines and you wake up and it's the next day. It's no good. Stardew Valley's a great game.
You don't want to do that. Yeah, I need to boot up Stardew Valley again. It's been too long. All right, so I think we've spoken enough about video games, but well, let's pick on one more topic. You recently started streaming on Twitch, right? So that's a live streaming platform where people usually play video games, but I think more and more the stuff that you and I like to do, like podcasting and just speaking to the camera IRL, that's becoming more popular on Twitch. But what do you think of the platform in terms of how it can advance either video games or the use of video games or knowledge or research? Like, do you have any interesting thoughts on the potential of Twitch?
Yeah. So I started watching Twitch before it was acquired. Who acquired it? Amazon. Somebody acquired it before that happened. And I would watch it to see people play games that I wanted to buy. So it's like, this game came out, but I don't know if I want to buy it. I'm going to find someone who's playing it and I'm going to watch it. And I think in that sense, Twitch is still very good for that because it's a different experience to watch the trailer than actually watch the gameplay and watch somebody play it and see how it goes. So that's always kind of been my number one use of Twitch, to be honest. But for like what I do and what you do, and I watch a lot of other people who do just chatting streams, I think Twitch is a great way to break the barriers between, for me, it would be a scientist, someone who studies games, and people and gamers, people who want to know games, or break the barriers, between a famous streamer that you just really admire and you get to interact with them in real time by being in their chat. It's like an equalizer. In that sense, I really enjoy it. And the reason I started streaming, I do enjoy streaming. It's very stressful for me. Like I said, I much prefer like making edited videos. But the videos aren't the same. It's different to have someone live and you can ask a question and, what do you think of Hellblade? And that person can just answer it. And I think that's a really unique and special thing about streaming. I know when I watch, someone stream and I have a question and they answer it, it's awesome, right? It's like, oh, this is really interesting. What do you think about this? Whereas on a video, you leave a comment and maybe they'll get back to you and maybe they won't. It's not the same.
Yeah, it's a interesting relationship that the chatters have with streamers, and you do feel a bit more sense of connection than you would in the YouTube comments when there's live feedback coming through. But I've heard some things about parasocial kind of effects and stuff like that. I haven't gotten too deep into the research and what might be going on there. I just think it's interesting. Have you heard anything about it?
Yeah, you need to have Dr. Emery Daniel on your show, who's another one in my circle. That is his area of specialty. But parasocial relationships was a term from the 1950s that was coined to describe the way you felt about TV personalities. So it's like, I watched Johnny Carson. This was the 50s. I feel like I know Johnny Carson. So if I saw him on the street, I have this sense that I know him, but he doesn't know who I am, right? Because I'm watching him from TV. And the same can be said of streamers. So you watch a streamer and you see them and you think that you know them. And they may interact with you and they may recognize, your screen name. But if they see you on the street, they're not going to know who you are, but you're going to feel that sense that you very much know who they are. So it's this weird kind of media phenomenon. I know Dr. Daniel could talk about it more, but it is really interesting. And it's also been linked to, the relationships we have with video game characters, even though they're, computer generated. We feel like, people in our Animal Crossing village, we have some kind of camaraderie with them, even though they're not real. So the science is really interesting on that.
Yeah. I need to have a look. I think I have some articles that I've bookmarked. I just never got around to reading them. But moving on to tabletop gaming. So I know you do play a bit of D&D, and I'm sure some other tabletop games. What is your view on kind of the differences that's going on in our mind between playing a video game versus playing something in person with people and speaking with them in terms of something that's interactive?
Yeah, I mean, there's tabletop is not my area of expertise. I do think that tabletop games and video games kind of have different stigmas associated with them. If we're specifically not talking about D&D, because we know D&D has a lot of stigma.
Oh yeah.
People generally see, I think, people playing at a table together superior somehow to people playing, through the internet, playing Valorant, even though socially it's pretty equivalent. I'm going to say it's pretty equivalent. Tabletop games, I think, are fantastic. There's a lot of people too who use D&D therapeutically. Dr. B from Take This, and all the guys and gals. There's gals there now too at Game to Grow. There's a lot of work happening now that is showing the power of tabletop games and the power of imagination, and being at that table together and creating these shared stories can not only be fun, but can also be intertwined with, classic psychological theories of like DBT and CBT and be therapeutic for the people who are playing them. So there's a lot of potential happening in that space. Like you said, a lot of the papers published on it are relatively recent. I feel like it's something that people are just now exploring. So I'll be interested to see where that goes in the next, 5-10 years.
So you mentioned therapeutic GMs. Could you define that for us?
Yeah, I can try. I am not one. A therapeutic DM is someone who creates a Dungeons and Dragons campaign specifically for the task of being used therapeutically. So I know at Game to Grow, they do like social skills groups. So they will create campaigns and they will create situations that require the characters to work together to solve larger problems and things like that. So they integrate it into the storytelling in ways to make them use the skills that they're trying to train them to develop and work together. Very cool.
It's fascinating and really cool, and it kind of legitimizes taking time out of your week to play some D&D if it helps you. For sure. But so tell us a bit about your gaming. I know you're part of this gaming group with a bunch of other therapeutic DMs. How is that? What's your character like? How are you enjoying playing?
Oh gosh. D&D is so this is really funny. So I was at PAX West 2 years ago, and Megan Connell, who's the DM of Clinical Role, was like, hey, do you play D&D? And I'm like, I don't actually play D&D. It's one of those things that I feel like just missed me. Like everyone around me was playing it when I was a kid, but I just never got into a campaign. But I was always really interested. So she was like, oh, you've never played? We could add a new person. Like, why don't you play on stream for the first time ever? That's a great idea. And I was like, sure, let's do that.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
If you want to see somebody not know what they're doing and learn how to do D&D live, you can go back to those original episodes because that's fun. No, she's wonderful and great. So I joined the Clinical Role campaign, and she started me kind of on a side campaign with Jack Birkenstock from the Bodhana Group, which also does therapeutic tabletop games. They're wonderful. And it's really interesting because I love video games. I love role-playing games. I remember the very first episode, she was like, what does your character say? And I was like, I got to make up the dialogue. Like I play video. It was so awkward to me to be like, oh, I have to decide. It was so weird.
You can't click a button and
better. Give me some options. I don't know what to do. And the first 5 minutes I'm climbing up a mountain, and she's like, what's your hair look like? And I was like, what does my hair? I was like, it's long. And Jack was like, well, that's impractical. You're climbing a mountain. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, so my character is a druid, a water genasi druid, because I just opened up the book and I was like, what sounds fun? And I prefer druids. I played World of Warcraft for a long time. I really like druids. And then as the storyline went on, I decided to dual class as a rogue because my story evolved into that I was this really cool pirate captain. And I thought rogues' swashbuckling skills really went along with the story. So it's really fun. We've been playing for almost 2 years. The campaign actually ends this year. Okay. But it's been a really great learning experience, and it's with the two founders of Game to Grow, and Dr. B, who is the clinical director of Take This, and Megan Connell is one of the founders of Geeks Like Us. So they are all therapeutic DMs, and then there's the researcher. There's me. So it's really fun too to play with, like, they're basically professional masters, right? They all do voices, and they know all the tricks, and they know like, oh, I have to roll this, and I'm still like, what do I roll for initiatives on a D20? So it's really fun to play with them.
Yeah. I'm planning to actually start a D&D stream at some point.
Fun!
It's not going to be, well, I don't plan it to be like what other people do. Actually, I'll just say it's going to be like just one shots with one person, maybe two.
Oh, cool.
At a time. It's, what do you call it? Tandem? No, it's not tandem D. I forget the correct term for it. But I think it'll be kind of like doing an interview, but, in D&D. And I'm going to bring in...
that sounds awesome.
Yeah, bring in aspects of research into it, because... my day job is academia, so I'm going to have this kind of like researchers guild, which is going to be interesting. Yeah. So once it's up and running, I'll invite you to come and guest if you would like.
To come be a noob, happily. Noob. I still barely know what I'm doing, but I'll come. I'll roll some dice.
Noob again. But I think with that, Dr. Kowert, it's time to kind of pack up our camp and head off to either our labs or our fantasy worlds. But first... Dr. Kowert, why don't you let our fellow explorers know where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Kowert, DrKowert. You can also find me at Psychgeist on Twitter, SYCHGEIST_ because someone has the name and isn't using it. And that's also my name on YouTube and on Twitch. You can just find me under Psychgeist.
And of course,
no underscore. That's only for Twitter.
Unfortunately. Did you contact the person with Zeitgeist and ask for that handle?
Did. I know. They won't give it to me.
Oh, shame. My apologies. It's one of those things. And of course, go check out Critical Role as well. And the Psychology of the Table, I think it's called. Psychology at the Table. It's a series that Dr. Megan Connell does on YouTube. That's pretty cool. I've seen a few episodes of that. I find it fascinating.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. But thank you, Dr. Kowert, for joining us, and thank you, the listener, for sparing your time. And I hope you had fun learning with us today. Otherwise, stay safe, keep well, stay tuned, and cheers.